Chair of this committee. Today, we're conducting a meeting of the Standing Senate Committee on Energy, the Environment, and Natural Resources. I would like to begin with a reminder. Before asking and answering questions, I would like to ask members and the witness in the room to please refrain from leaning in too close to the microphone or removing their earpiece when doing, or that they remove their earpiece if they do so to lean in. This will avoid any sound feedback that could negatively impact the committee staff in the room. I invite my colleagues to introduce themselves, beginning to my right.
Thank you. David Arnott, I'm a senator from Saskatchewan. I live in Treaty 6 territory.
Judy White, Senator from Newfoundland and Labrador.
Karen Sorensen, Alberta, Banff National Park, Treaty 7 territory.
Mary Lou McPhedran, Independent Senator for Manitoba.
Rosa Galvez from Quebec.
Aujourd'hui, le comité a...
Today, the committee has invited the sponsor of the bill, the Senate sponsor of the bill, and government officials to appear as part of its examination of Bill C-226, an act respecting the development of a national strategy to assess, prevent, and address environmental racism and to advance environmental justice.
Apologize for our delay. The rules are very clear. We cannot meet, the committee cannot meet if Senate is still sitting. So sorry for the delay. But as a consequence, unfortunately, we still got to finish our session by 8:30. So we'll cut down each session by 40 minutes if you can. So not too much, and I would appreciate your cooperation to get there. Le premier panel, our first panel, Elizabeth May, députée, une dame très reconnue par nous tous et très appréciée, from Saanich Gulf Islands, marraine du projet de la loi. L'honorable
and the Honourable Senator Mary Jane McCallum, also sponsor of the bill.
Je vous souhaite la bienvenue et vous
Welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Vous avez chacun
10 minutes are reserved for your opening remarks. This will be each, and then the floor is yours, Ms. May, to be followed by Senator McCallum, and questions will follow. As I say, we will begin with Ms. May. We have a senator who has just arrived. Chair, would you be kind enough to introduce yourself?
Bonjour, merci. Quebec.
Merci.
Thank you. And once again, sorry for the delay.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for inviting me to make a presentation regarding this highly important bill. C-226, as you have already said, this is a bill for working up developing a national strategy to assess, prevent, and very important, to address environmental racism and to advance environmental justice, and for a program that will really make a difference to support environmental justice.
I know I've got exactly 10 minutes. I want to make sure, I know you are pressed for time, that we have enough time for discussion. So I wanted to stress in the presentation of this private member's bill, and also, of course, want to thank Senator Mary Jane McCallum for being the sponsor of this bill in the Senate. I want to thank the Senate as an institution and individuals within it for having already seen the bill through to getting to this stage of past second reading in the Senate and in front of this committee. It's certainly my intention to emphasize that I hope the bill will receive speedy passage here. The time limits built into this bill mean that once it receives royal assent, the government will have 2 years within which to put forward the most important part of the bill, which is not just talking about the problem, but putting in place a strategy that will work. So in struggling with how to present the bill, as I'm always torn between setting out all the empirical evidence that Canada has an issue with environmental racism, that it's a thing that exists. I shouldn't make any reference to social media in polite company anyway, but the treatment of the issue in social media lets me know that some people mock the very notion. So I want to set out, rather than explain all the reasons that we know that there is such a thing. I know you will have other expert witnesses coming before you. I want to briefly summarize how I came to this issue, but more importantly, to set out what other jurisdictions have already done, because we are not dealing here in Canada with an unknown issue or with a tabula rasa. We have experience from other jurisdictions, and I hope we will build on that. So again, I want to thank the chair and the members of the committee for being here today. I first started working on this issue so very long ago. I'm from Cape Breton Island before I was from Vancouver Island. And in working on an issue which some of you may recall, the issue of the Sydney tar ponds. They were Canada's largest toxic waste site. And working on that issue through the 1990s and in the early 2000s, Canada's largest toxic waste site was the creation of putting a steel mill in what became industrial Cape Breton in the beginning of the 20th century. And that steel mill used extremely contaminated local Cape Breton coal, created a toxic waste site out of what had been an indigenous fishing grounds. And it created what became known as the Sydney tar ponds, les étangs goudrons de Nouvelle-Écosse à Ile de Cap-Breton à Sydney.
So these tar ponds in Sydney are what I'm mentioning here.
A pretty idyllic little spot called Margaree Harbour, 42 people. And if anyone had told me, well, when they did tell me that there was such a thing as any racism in Cape Breton, I would have been astonished and denied it. And it wasn't until one of my best friends, Clotilda Yakimchuk, was originally from the Caribbean. She was the first black woman in Nova Scotia to graduate from Nurses College. She was the first black woman to be the president of the Nova Scotia Nurses College. She received an Order of Canada for her leadership in many areas. But she told me a story that shocked me to my shoes. She told me that when she'd come back from running a hospital in the Caribbean as a single mom with young kids, she'd gotten a job at St. Rita's Hospital in Sydney, and she wanted to rent a decent place to raise her kids. And there was no landlord who would rent her a decent home anywhere in Sydney except between the steel mill and the coke ovens. There was enforced segregation in my community, and I knew nothing about it. Now that meant if you only could live between the coke ovens and the steel mill, where you were living was the equivalent of smoking several packs of cigarettes a day because of the pollution from the coke ovens and the pollution from the steel mill. So the first person and community with whom I started working on environmental racism was with Clotilda Yakimchuk, the community of Sydney. And we, through a series of coincidences, and mostly through my work with Sierra Club, I was executive director of Sierra Club of Canada, came to know that there was in the United States a program in environmental justice through the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And we created a project called, we twinned with a community in Fort Valley, Georgia, an African-American community, where they were dealing with an old pesticide plant that had been shut down, and they were accessing programs through the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to confront environmental racism, programs in environmental justice. You can go to the U.S. EPA website, and when you get my brief, and I apologize, désolé que ce n'est pas, j'ai demandé un traducteur.
And I'm sorry, I did ask for a translation from the House of Commons system. Unfortunately, we don't have it yet.
But from the U.S. EPA website is their definition of environmental justice, and I commend it to all of us. Means the just treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of income, race, color, national origin, tribal affiliation, or disability, in agency decision-making or other federal activities that affect human health and the environment. It's an intersectional definition, and it means that people in marginalized communities in the U.S. can access experts. They can confront the deep pockets of polluters with their own experts, lawyers, epidemiologists, hydrologists, doctors, to help to get a rebalancing of the power imbalance between the polluters and the communities. So we approach C-226 with experience from other jurisdictions. I also want to commend to this committee work from Europe. The United Nations Economic Commission for Europe has a convention called the Aarhus Convention, which is a convention that deals with access to information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice in environmental matters. Aarhus is a city in Denmark. The convention has developed a number of tools, and I think that they will also provide assistance to our government when, I hope, the bill passes. And we now have an Environment Canada website and Environment Canada people who are very dedicated, working on what a program in environmental justice will look like. And the website notes that this is, I'll quote from the website, environmental racism and justice is a new area of work for the Government of Canada. If I leave you with nothing else, I want to leave you with this. It is not a new area of work in the world. It's a new area of work in Canada. We have experience from the United States, a program since 1994, which has grown and even recently grown even further under the Biden administration. Tools for environmental justice are not bumper stickers. Tools for environmental justice are real and in the hands of marginalized communities, Indigenous peoples, racialized communities, are tools to access rights and justice and rights that exist. This bill will make a huge difference, but it will take ongoing work, and I am ready for your questions, and thank you for your attention.
Merci, Madame May. C'est très apprécié.
Thank you, Ms. May. This is much appreciated. Now I recognize Senator Mary Jane McCollum.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you all for being here today, and a special thank you to you for sponsoring this bill. Social justice and societal expectation holds that all Canadians have the right to clean air, water, land, and health. But countless First Nations and Black communities on Turtle Island continue to face some of the worst environmental devastation and degradation in our country. Yet Canadian governments continue to fail in addressing environmental inequity and racism as an important policy problem. Environmental ethics considers the relationship between humans and the environment and how human actions impact the ecosystems that surround us. Pollution, the depletion of natural resources, loss of diversity, destruction of ecosystems, and climate change are all part of the ethics debate. Ethics are imperative to the survival of humanity because in not adhering to them now, the world inherited by our future generations would be inhabitable. The article entitled Environmental Racism and First Nations, A Call for Socially Just Public Policy Development states, while the U.S. environmental justice movement has developed at an exponential rate, Canadian efforts have been far less effective, resulting in uneven attention to and action regarding environmental justice. Canadian legislation that deals directly with the inequalities created by environmental injustice is for the most part non-existent. Current public policy regarding environmental justice for First Nations people is needed to ensure equal rights to a safe environment for all Canadians, regardless of race and/or economic status. Failure to commit to such change is tantamount to endorsing the continuance of racist practices, a far cry from the goal of a just society, close quote. You will hear firsthand from witnesses their own realities of how environmental racism through capital colonialism has severely disrupted their communities, families, governance, lives, health, self-determination, and culture. That is why social justice for First Nations involves relations-based respect, upholding First Nations knowledge systems and worldviews, identity and culture, and understanding what colonization did to our people. In T.K. Alfred's book entitled It's All About the Land, he states, removing us from our land has been the project from the beginning, where the native opposes the development of the land for exploitive purposes. That native is defined out of existence or pushed out of existence. For us to defer to this notion of Aboriginal and try to structure ourselves and conceptualize our processes and goals accordingly is the end game of colonization. In the 7 years I have been a senator, I, along with other ENEV committee members, have heard about environmental and health hazards affecting Indigenous communities across Canada, but little has been done to correct this injustice. Long-term solutions to these issues around pollution prevention include strengthening regulations. Equitable remediation has been largely ignored by industry. One just has to look at the number of orphan wells or the leakage of tailings ponds into our water systems. It is time to confront environmental racism, which systematically constructs inequities by conferring advantages upon one racial group at the expense of others. Power and privilege are distributed unevenly, enabling industry and government to allow private control of extractive systems where, in the quest for profit and land, the public is exposed to known, disproportionate risks and effects with little protective or preventive action taken. Bill C-226 is intentionally not prescriptive in how to develop and execute the national strategy, as it must be developed in concert with affected individuals and communities. As we begin deliberation of Bill C-226, I make comments under the headings of assessing, preventing, and addressing environmental racism. To assess environmental racism, environmental inequity becomes racism when environmental harms and lack of access to protective features disproportionately affect racialized communities. The term is used to bring attention to the outsized role that structural racism plays in contributing to environmental inequities. Environmental inequity has a long history in Canada, yet no national initiative exists to address the disproportionate and deliberate exposure of certain populations to environmental hazards. The paucity and insufficiency of health assessment data, including health of land, water, air, and ecosystem, and their effect on the humans and non-humans who live in these areas remain unresolved. In assessing environmental racism, we must no longer rely on assumptions. We need facts. Neighborhood scale mapping holds great promise for assisting communities in identifying risks posed by environmental hazards to different social groups and for the development of more detailed, complete, and positionally accurate information by incorporating local knowledge. Under prevention, prevention requires understanding of how structural racism contributes to environmental inequities. The contribution of racialized communities in data collection around land use, public health, and environmental conditions can help influence policy and planning decisions. To address environmental racism, environment is deeply intertwined with human health. Consideration of a holistic approach to making intersectional change will most benefit from involving multiple sectors, including but not limited to racialized communities, grassroots, researchers, health practitioners, industry leaders, and government. Extractive capitalism violently and continually perpetuates dramatic social and economic inequalities that limit First Nations sovereignty and autonomy. As First Nations, we have witnessed extractive capitalism's technique of domination by expansion through a series of legal, rhetorical, economic, and political ways that erase autonomy of First Nations in their territories.
Just a second, if we can give you another 2 minutes, then after that we go to question period.
Okay. It is in the heart of this resource-rich territories that First Nations exist in complex tensions with extractive capitalism and land defense, where they protect land and each other at often extremely high personal and communal cost. I want to encourage everyone here to foster deliberative decision-making in this critical endeavor. We must remember that the best interest of all children and the generations yet to come continue to be at stake, and that those rights are entitled to full and fair consideration of the impacts of environmental racism. Thank you.
Very, very much. I'll go to question period. Senator Arnott.
Thank you. I hope to ask 2 questions. I know time's really tight, so I'm just going to cut right to the chase. So, Senator McCallum, in your sponsor's speech, you emphasized the unique perspectives and experience of Indigenous peoples bringing to the table. How should Indigenous knowledge, ways of knowing, and practices be integrated into the national strategy to combat environmental racism effectively? And my question for Ms. May is, Ms. May, you referenced the U.S. Environmental Justice Program as a model. Your specific elements of the U.S. approach, what specific elements of the U.S. approach do you believe should be adapted or avoided in the Canadian context to effectively address environmental racism? I'm not sure that I'm going to get an oral answer in time, so I would like a written answer if we can.
Let's start. Who would like to answer that question?
I'll start. When we look at Indigenous knowledges, that is best done by the knowledge keepers. So and that's why I said community grassroots need to be involved in this, and I hope that they will be. Yeah. And they're the best person to bring that.
Ms. May, you want to add?
Yeah. I really remiss and wanted to thank and put on the record deep gratitude to Dr. Ingrid Waldron. I know she'll be a witness at the committee, so I wanted to say that her academic research sets up the bar on this issue. The engagement of Indigenous peoples in the consultation and other marginalized communities and racialized communities is critical. The experience I've seen with the US EPA Environmental Justice Program, and the part that I would want to recommend to the government to consider once the bill has passed, is putting the tools in the hands of the communities themselves that allow them to harness their own Indigenous knowledge, harness and mobilize their own agency and empowerment and sovereignty to bring solutions to their own communities through access to the tools that are needed. We have built into our legal system, I used to practice law, we have built into our legal system barriers for communities that don't have deep pockets. Things like cost awards to punish a group that causes trouble. Things like injunctive relief that overwhelmingly goes to corporations and not to communities that are trying to protect human health. Things like SLAP suits that only in some provinces are not allowed. SLAP standing for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. So the goals here are at every stage: engagement with the marginalized communities where we find them, and their empowerment to act on their own behalf, to using the legal tools that rebalance what Dr. McCallum has already referenced quite accurately as a pattern of colonialism and disempowerment and exploitation and abuse that has created structural imbalances that definitely fit the definition of environmental racism.
Senator Arnott, did you have a supplementary?
I don't think I want to take the time. I'll cede to my other senators. I have lots of questions that I would have loved to have asked, but I got the two that I wanted, so thank you.
You count yourself lucky, right? Yeah. Okay. Senator Sorensen?
Thanks very much. My first question is quite quick, and I would try and get a second one in. So the bill's about collecting information and having a strategy put in place that addresses and prevents environmental racism and promotes environmental justice. However, the text of Bill C-226 doesn't contain official definitions of either of those. And I guess I'm asking, do you think it would be helpful for the terms to be defined within the body of the legislation for greater clarity?
Addressing that to whom?
Well, actually, I'm interested. I guess I'll go to Ms. May to see if we can help with that, if you think it's necessary.
Let me also say another person I neglected to thank was the original author of this bill, former Member of Parliament, Lenore Zan. And I, in looking at the bill and taking it forward myself, because it had already gone through committee, I'm more concerned to make sure that we get it passed than that we add or amend.
Okay.
Anyway, so and I will say that because there's a general understanding and well understood definitions that exist, that's why when the House Environment Committee looked at this, they decided to proceed without adding definitions.
Thanks, that's perfect, and if they would need it in the report, they can do it in the report. My second question to both of you, maybe Senator McCallum can jump in first. Many of the examples of environmental racism in Canada are the consequences of overlapping jurisdictions between federal government, provinces, territories, and munis. Do you believe that the strategy that will come out of this bill will be able to address this issue? What work needs to be done to ensure that environmental racism is going to be considered in community planning? And I mean, I don't mean Indigenous communities. I mean non-Indigenous communities, which, as you know, lies outside of the federal jurisdiction and in provinces and territorial decision making.
The issue of jurisdictional gaps have always existed for First Nations, and it has existed forever. So when we start to have the conversation in Senate about an issue, a lot of this was brought to me from First Nations people and also other people that are marginalized. When we start that conversation, it allows them to give voice in their own provinces and to start working with the provincial government and to start working with their municipality. So in Manitoba, there is a policy on environmental racism and how they are to work with First Nations. Sometimes it doesn't work like with hydro, but that's ongoing work. And it's the ongoing work that makes the characters of the people come out so that they are going back to the way that they used to be before colonization came in. That they're giving voice, that they're getting stronger, and they know they're resilient. So,
Thank you.
Advice?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you so much for bringing up this legislation. It's been a long time we are waiting for it, and it is absolutely needed. There are big cases such as the Mississippi River Valley, the Toxic Valley, that affects so millions of people. But there are small cases too, like for example, in my own city of Quebec, we have the Bass Bill, which suffered the pollution with nickel from the port that it's there for years. So my question is the following. So we have all cases that are there, you know, that it's been for years and years, and people have collected data, medical data, on the effects. But then we have recent things that are happening, you know, like the Chipa one, the toxic that just spilled all kinds of toxic substances. So I want to know concretely in the actions, how will this framework push for action to solve the problem? That's my first question.
when we look at the action that's needed, that has to come from the communities. They're the ones that are undergoing actively the environmental racism. They know their land. They know their governance systems. So it's almost like unique solutions that each of these communities will bring forward. That's why it's important that they be involved in the work that we do.
Exactly right. And I'd just add that in terms of Senator Sorensen's question, this isn't a question where you need to figure out constitutionally which box is the problem in. This is a question of rights exist, and access to those rights has to be rebalanced through removal of barriers, and then the tools for agency are in the community's hands to resolve the problems. There'll be different characteristics of problems. And as you say, some are historic, some are new. But if you have access to rights and access to justice, you pursue those in ways where the rebalancing happens through tools that a community with lots of money that might not would be not racialized and not indigenous and was within a structure that assumes the power is there, so that we don't see a toxic waste site in Rockcliffe Park. We don't see contamination occurring in Rosedale. These are obvious things across Canada. That's why with the tools in the hands of the community, they will find and will make concrete changes, because the courts will see to it, the authorities will see to it, once those communities can access the tools for equal justice.
So it brings me to my second question, which is how does this bill connects or interacts with other bills like the one that we recently passed on the
S5?
Strengthening environmental protection for a healthier Canada Act, or even the CEPA that we just modernized.
They're very closely connected. Is any suggestion of Canada putting in place quantifiable and enforceable environmental rights? It's very closely related to this, and right now Environment Canada's website links the two. But the bill can stand on its own without those, but clearly the work that was done, and work that was done by many senators on Bill S5, improved the characteristics of and the quality of what can be described as rights to a healthy environment, not rights for the environment. Canada didn't take that leap that, for instance, Bolivia and other countries have taken, but this is very focused on, do humans have the right to clean air, clean water, healthy soils? Regardless, do humans, whether indigenous or racialized, wealthy or impoverished, have those rights to those? Now, those rights are funneling now towards us through the evolution of S5.
Okay.
Thank you very much to our experts, our witnesses. C'est très apprécié. Thank you.
Your contributions are appreciated.
I'm sure we'll learn a lot from it. It's the start of an important process to inform ourselves and recommend the appropriate action. So thank you very, very much. Now we'll ask our second panel if they to step up and take your place. Faut que je parle? Et, pour notre deuxième panel,
For our second panel now, we welcome from Environment and Climate Change Canada, Ms. Heather McCready, Director General, Legislative and Regulatory Affairs. Ms. Susan Martin, Director General, Strategic Policy Directorate. And Ms. Amanda Monforton, Director, Policy Development, Environmental Justice, and Gender-Based Analysis Plus. I believe it is Ms. Monforton who will be speaking. If I'm correct, you have 10 minutes. Please go ahead. Thank you very much and good evening.
As a principle and concept has grown and evolved since the early inception in the 1980s. There is no established definition. However, the principles and concepts of environmental justice are broadly understood to include improved procedural, recognitional, and distributive justice. Procedural justice and recognitional justice seek to improve the ways in which decisions are made and to ensure that those who are affected by environmental injustice are reflected and included in decision-making spaces. Distributive justice involves identifying the ways in which certain populations face disproportionate environmental burdens, such as pollution, and seeking to improve environmental benefits for those communities. In Canada, the issue of environmental racism has been studied for decades. Provincially, a similar bill has been debated since 2015 in response to Indigenous and African Nova Scotian communities that have been most impacted by environmental racism. The African Nova Scotian communities of Birchtown and Shelburne, Nova Scotia, were historically among the largest settlements of Black people outside of Africa, and these Canadians continue to experience the harms of environmental racism. Last week, Minister Guilbeault heard from the Black community in Shelburne, and I had the privilege to join him. We heard of the ongoing impacts of the Morven Road landfill located in the south end of Shelburne, uphill and in direct proximity to a community of African Nova Scotians. The landfill was used for residential, industrial, and medical waste from eastern Shelburne County and was burned for 75 years. Although labeled a landfill, this is excavated land used for waste storage with no protection of ground or surface water and allowed open burning of the trash. The landfill closed because of the community's grassroots efforts in 2016 surrounding the disproportionate impacts of the ongoing environmental burden and related socioeconomic impacts of the Black community. Community members Chris Jacklin, Christina Farmer, and Darlene Cooper, who spoke at the roundtable, walked me through the south end of town, and most importantly, brought me to the landfill to share their stories. These stories depicted the landfill as a childhood playground where they would find food, toys, and more. As adults, they now understand the hazards and are advocating for future generations. Au niveau fédéral, le concept
Federally, the concept of a national environmental justice strategy was first considered when the member for Cumberland, Colchester, introduced Private Member's Bill C-230 in February 2020. I understand that the situation in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, was a key driving force behind the bill's introduction. Bill C-230 died on the order paper when the 2021 election was called, and an amended bill, the bill we're discussing today, was reintroduced in February 2022.
Would require the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada to develop, in consultation or cooperation with any persons, bodies, organization, or communities, a national strategy to assess, prevent, and address environmental racism. Such a strategy would be the first focused approach at the national level to redressing environmental racism. Bill C-226 requirement to develop a national strategy respecting environmental racism and environmental justice aligns with the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada's 2021 mandate letter commitment. Since environmental justice is a broad set of principles and or concepts, there are several direct references to environmental justice in federal initiatives. Gender-based analysis plus is a key component of the government's decision-making process and is used to assess how different subgroups of the population may experience policies, programs, and initiatives. There are also other tangible examples of opportunities to address environmental justice issues through programs like the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan and our minister's mandate to identify and prioritize the cleanup of contaminated sites in areas where Indigenous peoples, racialized, and low-income Canadians live. And there's broader policy initiatives like the Federal Anti-Racism Strategy, which seeks to more widely consider the impacts of policies and programs on racialized, Indigenous, and religious minority communities. Canada's National Adaptation Strategy is another example of recent federal policy framework that considers concepts of environmental justice, where advancing equity, climate, and environmental justice is one of the strategies for guiding principles. On the legislative front, the Government of Canada now recognizes that every individual in Canada has the right to a healthy environment under the modernized Canadian Environmental Protection Act. CEPA now requires the consideration of a number of principles, including environmental justice, within the context of implementing a right to a healthy environment under the Act. While issues related to environmental justice are being considered in many contexts across the Government of Canada, a national strategy, as required by the bill, would have its own specific objectives and intent. Reading the preamble, the intent of the bill is clear. Focusing the strategy on the intersection of environmental hazards and marginalized communities would be important to maintaining a manageable scope within the broader concept of environmental justice in the short legislated timeline and to deliver meaningful, measurable outcomes. Within this scope, an eventual strategy could explain the legislation, policies, and programs and initiatives that contribute to the strategy outcomes, demonstrate policy coherence, and could identify gaps to be closed via targeted interventions in existing programs. From an Indigenous perspective, to respect the United Nations Declaration Act, the government would explore potential approaches to developing a strategy that reflects the rights of Indigenous peoples across Canada, regardless of location, and to ensure Indigenous ways of knowing are respected. In preparation to meet the requirements of Bill C-226, and to inform a Canadian-specific approach to the development of an environmental justice strategy, the Department has undertaken research on the concept along with policies, initiatives, and models that exist in other jurisdictions. In closing, I'd like to thank you for inviting my colleagues and I to speak with you today. We are happy to answer any questions you have related to your study of the Bill C-226. Chimigwech.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. On commence avec Senator Galvez.
Let's begin with Senator Galvez. Thank you, Chair.
Tonight to answer our questions. So, first, it's impacting that you are recognizing that you knew about environmental racism for decades. So it took decades to put this bill there and to support it, because now it's supported by the government, which is very good. But I think that devil is in the details. And when we study here SIPA, modernization, there were two important changes. One is that we took out prevention and replaced it with control and management of pollution. But I think that if we don't prevent pollution, we will end up always in the situation of having to clean up whatever. So I would like you to put in context these changes. The other thing, again, is that another important change in SIPA was that the Schedule 1 list of toxic substances got changed, its name, and now it's only called Schedule 1. So that makes that now in the courts, people are, debating what is toxic, what is not toxic, plastic is toxic, it's not toxic. And so all of this puts a lot of confusion and doesn't make the court case clear, or we put too much pressure in courts to come and take a position. So can you please clarify how are you going to harmonize this bill with SIPA and with other, the environmental impact assessment that was also modernized, that says that cumulative effects, climate change should be considered today.
And who should answer that question?
Yeah, Mr. McCready.
I think I can take that one. So I'm Heather McCready. I'm the Director General of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Thank you for the question. We may end up wanting to follow up with you in writing because I think there may be important contributions from our colleagues at Health Canada on your question, particularly relating to toxic substances. I'll start by saying that the environmental justice and the concept of a right to a healthy environment are related and complementary, but not identical. As we heard from the witnesses earlier this evening, both of these concepts are important and support each other. A right to a healthy environment, first of all, applies specifically to SIPA and the things that SIPA governs and the administration of that particular act, not other acts, where environmental justice could be broader. Whereas environmental justice is focusing on addressing wrongs to do with environmental racism, so necessarily focuses on specific communities and specific areas, but they are related together. The specific changes that were made to SIPA as a result of Bill S5 included a number of things. There were two main focuses, which you would all remember very well, as you were a big part of this. One being the strengthening of the chemicals management regime, and then secondly, adding the right to a healthy environment. On the question of chemicals, again, on the specifics, we'll probably consult with colleagues from Health Canada to help explain some of those a bit better. But the overall intent is to strengthen the way that we manage chemicals in Canada. So while you had specific questions about the word prevention, I think the overall intent is to provide additional tools and additional clarity that will actually provide a regime that is stronger than before. So there may be wording changes that provide a bit of confusion, potentially because they're new, but these things are being worked out in the implementation strategy for the implementation framework, for the right to a healthy environment and the related things that go with the implementation of Bill S5. So I might leave it there on that one, unless you have anything to add. Okay.
Supplementary?
Yes. So one very important question is, who does the cause-effect study to determine when there is pollution that has caused health problems and environmental racism in racialized communities? Who will run that study?
Thank you so much for the question. So as you know, in the bill, it does indicate that there is a requirement for a study. This includes statistics about the location of environmental hazards and socioeconomic profiles. The Government of Canada has a wealth of information on environmental releases. It also has a wealth of information on socioeconomic status. So the intention is for the Government of Canada, if the bill were to come into force, to undertake that study and use the study to help inform the development of the strategy.
Thank you. Senator White.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious about when you talked about the consult and cooperate with interested persons. I would be really curious about the scope of the consultations. There's a lack of details in the bill, but I didn't expect that to be in the bill anyway. And how exhaustive will it be? When are you going to consult, and when are you going to cooperate, and what groups will be determined? So a big question, but I'd be very curious to what your thinking is as of now. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So yes, certainly there is an emphasis on consultation in the bill. You're right. So our thinking is that that will be a significant feature, obviously, of our work over the next 2 years. But I think, as you heard earlier this evening, that collaboration with the communities doesn't end at the end of the 2-year mark when the strategy is tabled. I do think there's a certain amount of consultation on what people would like to see from this strategy, and then there's a certain amount of collaboration when you're talking to specific communities that have had experienced environmental racism to help identify what are those things those communities need, the tools they need to be able to address the situation. And that will help inform some of the broad measures that might find their way into the strategy, but it may also inform the kinds of measures that might ensue following the publishing of the strategy as the work unfolds over the next several years.
Do you have a supplementary?
Yeah, so at what point then do you think that the minister's obligation as it relates to consultation and cooperation with these groups would be fulfilled?
So that's a great question. I think that his requirement to consult on the strategy, that will happen within the 2-year period, the timeline that's legislated by the bill. So there's obviously, with any kind of strategy the government develops, there's always a period of consultation to ensure that the policy that's being developed meets the needs of those it's serving. It wouldn't be any different in this case. So that part of the consultation requirement, I think, will be met in the context of the development of the strategy. So yes, within the first 2 years.
Thank you. Senator McCallum.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. In my brief, I had said that very little has been done. And when I look at what the government has put in place, the gender-based analysis, the federal anti-racism strategy, the Canadian National Adaptation Strategy, and then we look at CEPA. And so we have legislation in place that should already address or lessen the impacts of resource extraction. And, so it appears that there are some safeguards in place that would promote environmental justice and equality in certain sections 22 and 185.2 of CEPA. But it also appears that there's a breakdown that occurs when it comes time to implement and follow the regulation of the law. Because we work with First Nations, our office across Canada, and things are not improving. That's why I said nothing is being done, because no one is listening or implementing, and I'm talking about industry. So, and you say you already have a wealth of info on stats. So you have everything, it seems you have everything in place. What is going to change now that things will move ahead as they should, and that we, First Nations and the Black community, doesn't continue to live in places that are unhealthy when we have the right? We always had the inherent right to a healthy environment.
So thank you very much for the question. I think a couple of pieces here, and then I may pass to my colleagues to add in, but it's important to recognize that the right to a healthy environment is limited to CEPA. And so the issues of environmental racism go much broader than just CEPA. So that is the first part there. The second piece is, having a strategy that can have focused, targeted efforts coming together and really understanding how those initiatives are working to advance environmental justice overall, but specifically, what are those pieces that need to be, because every community will be different. The issues of environmental injustice in one community to another may be very different. And so really making sure that there's one thing for a national piece, and then there's something else when you look at it a little bit more focused. But having that focused strategy provides the attention to the issue. And maybe I will see if there's anything else to add.
Yeah, so I think you've covered it well. Thank you, Amanda. I do think that that is the real difference with this piece of legislation, is that it puts at the forefront the goal of addressing environmental racism as an issue, as opposed to it being a secondary thing that's considered in the context of other policies, programs, and initiatives in the purview of the Government of Canada.
Senator Arnott?
Thank you. I've got a question and a follow-up if I get time. I want to dig down on the clarification on consultation concerns. And with respect to Bill C-226, some have argued that the consultation process is overly broad in scope. And I know that the information collection and consultation are central to the work that you do, particularly the kind of processes described in this bill. Could you elaborate on how you plan to implement an optimal consultation process and what you do to ensure that specific groups and stakeholders are directly involved in the discussions?
Thank you for the question. So what you've raised are really two really important parts of the work that would be ahead of us should this bill come into force. As you mentioned, there's a study. The study will help us understand the issue. It will help us understand where the problems are, where they're most acute, and who we should therefore be talking to understand exactly what needs to be done to address this important issue. So I think that it's fair to say the consultation would unfold in two phases. One that is more broad, that is trying to understand from any interested party what their views are on this issue before using the information that's available through the study that would be undertaken to help focus engagement with those groups that have been most affected by environmental racism. And as I mentioned earlier, the work with these communities would continue beyond the publishing of the strategy. It necessarily has to ensure that these issues are addressed.
So a supplemental question. With respect to Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing and experiences, how do you see that being incorporated in the development of this strategy?
Thanks for the question. So that's actually quite important because I think you need to look at Indigenous ways of knowing from a distinctions-based approach as well, and what First Nations may do may be different than what, let's say, Métis rights holders may be looking at. So I think from that perspective, what this looks like, and I think this is where we've spoken about, do we have to do a more focused approach to respect the United Nations Declaration Act? And so I think this is the important piece where we have to say, as the Government of Canada, how do we interact and how do we really ensure that we are able to use the holistic nature of the way Indigenous ways of knowing work in that holistic approach rather than saying that it's just one consideration. It actually has to be weaved and braided all through the work that we do.
Okay. There's one other element I'd like you to address if you could. If Bill C-226 does not become law, could specific amendments to existing laws like CEPA to combat environmental racism and advance environmental justice be implemented as a matter of policy?
I'll jump in on that one. This is an answer I always find a little frustrating to give because it's probably frustrating to receive, that it's not really appropriate for us to opine on any amendments, what the government should or should not do, because that's a question for Cabinet. But there are a number of initiatives underway in the department. Amanda mentioned several of them in her opening address that are relevant to the issues here. And I also mentioned earlier about a right to a healthy environment, which is a really important first step for the Government of Canada to have this be embedded in our primary piece of legislation that protects the environment and human health is an extraordinary step. So I think some of the work is done there, but this bill would go further and would complement those existing efforts.
Thank you. Senator Sorensen.
I think Ms. Martin had a comment.
To that. So I think just to kind of build on what Heather has already mentioned, I think there are a number of programs that operate in this space. So I think to look at individual amendments to different pieces would kind of make it more complex than actually a single bill that kind of goes at this issue directly.
Senator Sorensen.
I'm going to take an opportunity to get a bit of a status update. I think most people in the room are aware of this. Some may not be. Last year, Imperial Oil and the Alberta Energy Regulator hid from Athabasca Chippewa First Nation the fact that a massive spill had occurred in their community. And if it's okay, I thought I'd take an opportunity to just ask for an update on what's happening with that scenario. And I guess to tie it to the bill, do you believe that the strategy that will come out of this bill will assist the federal government with better tools, proper tools to ensure the protection of communities like Athabasca Chippewa First Nation and more accountability for, in this instance, the regulator?
So I'll take the first part of that. For the update, we will have to get back to you in writing.
Okay.
So
right.
Good that you got it on the record, but we'll get you a better answer from
I'd
the
be
appropriate
really curious
officials.
to know where it's at. I mean, I was reading an article from several months ago.
And then for the bill, I'll pass it over.
Yeah, sorry. For the bill itself, sorry, I'm just thinking of my words right now.
It's okay.
I think the bill itself, I mean, it will provide targeted interventions, of course. I think that's what the strategy would result in. And I think
Right.
if you think of that community in particular, I mean, it's important that a community addresses themselves as having experienced environmental racism. That's not something that one could say. But it's also understanding what they believe is the solutions on their end, and then how does the federal government then support them to continue advancing, advocating for the issue to have it addressed. Mm-hmm. Because again, the jurisdictional issues do come into play. And I would also add that how these pieces work together to get to an end result is really the important piece. So
yeah, I mean, the bill to me right now seems quite philosophical, and I'm looking for what do we do to. So I just have to accept that it's important this gets through and that it gets identified, and that the real, I guess, meat on the bones comes as we start to work on this strategy, and that there's a timeline to do that.
absolutely.
I think, as you notice, many of the questions, a lot of them surround with the fact, governments have a reputation to have bold ambitions, but sometimes the results are not there. And you can see a skepticism a little bit on our part, sort of saying, will it be any different? How serious is it? Do you have a lot of money? Do you have enough money? Do you have all the skill set? Or are we going to find ourselves 5 years from now sort of saying, well, it was a good opportunity, we nearly did it, we didn't get there, and everybody gets frustrated again. But in this case, in your own personal situation, do you have enough authority? Do you have enough money to get the job done?
So thank you for your question. I think it's a valid one to consider. So I will say that as was mentioned in the opening statement, this commitment was in our minister's mandate letter since the fall of 2021, and it's now the winter of 2024. So we've certainly had enough time to think about what this would mean if this bill were to come into force, what the work plan would look like, and to secure the resources we need to undertake the work towards the strategy development over the 2 years that would ensue from the bill coming into force. So I can confirm that we are prepared to undertake that work. We understand the work that needs to happen. And a decision on what the scope and scale of the strategy is, of course, will happen at a later date when the strategy is developed, and it will be resourced at that time accordingly.
Senator McCollum, you had a question.
Yes. I had touched on social justice and that it will be different for First Nations because of what we have lost. And its governance, it's not just economy. It is our history, our identity. So, and it is what we have lost through the land theft that still continues today. We just don't want to work within industry. We need to move out from underneath their oppression. So how can you see how you would work with the nations because they are nations. It's a different relationship completely from other groups. How would you work with the nations so that there is recolonization isn't happening?
So I think on this one, it's really important to look back to the UN Declaration Act and really to embody the free, prior, informed consent in developing this strategy. The way we work with First Nations and Indigenous rights holders would have to be the key element here in how we move forward. And I think working on that nation-to-nation level and ensuring that First Nations communities also understand really what this issue is. They understand how they are impacted by it, how they may want to be involved in the development of the strategy, and what they may need to be involved as well. And so those discussions, I think, is very important that they happen with the communities and the rights holders, because how one community works with the federal government may be different than how another community on the other side of Canada may want to work on this issue. And so from that regard, I think we're waiting to say how right now in order to really make sure that it responds to their requirements. And again, going back to free, prior, informed consent.
Yeah, last question from anybody else? Galvez, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. Thank you so much. This is very important. I know you're not going to say yes or no to my question, but I was thinking that there is still some not enough clarity about how all these 3 or 4 environmental protection legislations are going to complement each other. So I was wondering if maybe we can think about observation, that harmonize the impact assessment, the modernized SIPA, and the environmental racism. Because, as I said earlier, the devil is in the details. And if you don't have good definitions, then we're not going to solve the problem, and it's going to be just related to the future.
I can take that. So thank you for the question. So I think, without opining on, what changes could be made, I think it's important to understand what the intention is behind the strategy. And the strategy is to consider all of the existing interventions that operate in this space, the kinds of policies, programs, legislation, other initiatives that are brought to bear, including other factors that have led to a particular situation. The strategy in and of itself doesn't have a measure. It has a strategy that brings together all of these existing pieces. So in a sense, the strategy helps to provide that coherence around how those different pieces operate together and what perhaps adjustments or changes might be required to some of those pieces should they be found to be contributing to the problem.
Okay. Thank you very much. Again, you have a big job. You have an immense responsibility. You're very important to Canada, so I wish you all the best of luck. And if we can be of any help, let us know. It's very important. Thank you very much, and I adjourn the meeting as a consequence.